Welcome to the deep dive. Get ready, because we're going way beyond the phone in your hand or the TV on your wall today. We're pulling back the curtain on Samsung. Most people know the devices, but there's this massive, complex, and frankly, sometimes kind of unbelievable empire behind the brand.
That's right. And when we talk about Samsung, we really are talking about a multinational manufacturing conglomerate. It's huge, easily one of the world's biggest.
Right.
But its whole structure and influence are so deeply tied to South Korea. It's the country's largest chaebol, their term for these major family-controlled business groups.
And we've got quite a stack of sources here. Articles, reports, some research, our own notes covering pretty much everything. Their chip tech, which is fascinating.
Oh, yeah?
Their global footprint, what it's like on the factory floor, the corporate culture, some major controversies, definitely, and how they fit into the whole global economy, including like dealing with different currencies, the US dollar, all that.
Right, the mechanics of being that big.
Exactly. So our mission today is to cut through all that information and help you understand what's truly important, maybe surprising, and sometimes, a bit shocking about this global giant.
We're aiming to pull out the key insights, connect the dots for you, make sense of it all.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start with just the sheer scale. It's almost hard to really wrap your head around how big Samsung actually is. Our sources highlight that its overall turnover, well, it's equivalent to a fifth of South Korea's entire national gross domestic product.
Wait, hang on. A fifth of the whole country's economy? Just one company?
Yep, one company group.
That's absolutely mind-boggling. How does a single corporation even get that central to a nation's economic health?
Well, it really speaks to the unique structure, the historical role of these cables in South Korea's development after the war.
Okay.
And it's not just the economic muscle inside Korea. Globally, its brand value is ranked fifth highest in the world. That was as of 2024.
So massive power at home, huge recognition everywhere else. And the sources make it clear it's way beyond just phones and TVs.
Absolutely. Not at all. The list of affiliated businesses is kind of incredible when you see it laid out.
Like what?
Well, you've got Samsung Heavy Industries doing massive shipbuilding projects, Samsung Engineering, Samsung C&T, that's global construction, Samsung TechWin, involved in machinery, even weapons tech.
Weapons?
Yeah. Then there's SDS for huge IT services, Shield Worldwide handling advertising. They own amusement parks like Everlands.
Amusement parks?
Yep. Security systems through S1, hotels under the Shola brand. I mean, the list just keeps going. It's a truly sprawling industrial ecosystem.
It sounds less like a company and more like a miniature economy itself.
That's a good way to put it.
So how does that size, that diversification, how does it stack up against other tech giants we know, like, say, Apple?
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison.
Yeah.
And the sources we looked at offer different views depending on how you measure it and, which year you're looking at. Some older sources, maybe around 2013, 2014, they point to Samsung being significantly larger by revenue in just sheer number of employees.
Right.
Like one source cited Samsung Electronics revenue around nearly $149 billion versus Apple's $108 billion back in 2012. And employees. Samsung had like 270,000 compared to Apple's maybe 80,000 back then.
Huge difference.
But if you look at market cap or maybe more recent brand value numbers, Apple is often way ahead.
So maybe bigger in terms of that sprawling manufacturing base, the workforce,
Exactly.
but not always hitting those same sky-high market valuations. That's a key distinction.
Precisely. It really highlights Samsung's strength as this incredibly diversified manufacturer across so many different sectors. And, to push all those products globally, one source pointed out that Samsung Electronics alone spent something like an estimated $14 billion on advertising and marketing. That was back in 2013.
$14 billion just on ads.
Yeah.
That sounds astronomical.
It really is. Reportedly, that was something like 5.4% of their revenue that year.
Wow.
Which was a significantly larger slice than competitors like Apple. They spent only about 0.6%, apparently. Or even General Motors, which was around 3.5%.
So they were really pushing hard.
Oh, yeah. They actually became the world's biggest advertiser in 2012, according to that source. It tells you something, doesn't it? About their strategy for keeping that global market share across so many different product lines.
It really does. And operating at this massive global scale, I mean, they must constantly be dealing with different currencies, international finance. It must be incredibly complex.
Absolutely. The U.S. dollar, for instance, plays a huge role here.
Right.
Not just because, they sell a lot in the U.S. market, but because the dollar is still the main international reserve currency. It's used for a massive amount of global trade and financial transactions.
It's like the default language for big global
Pretty
business.
much. It's often the currency that global companies report their financials in, or, when they get hit with big international fines, those are often measured in US dollars.
Ah,
And that status, well, it's partly a legacy of things like the Bretton Woods Agreement after World War II, which really cemented its central role in global finance. And that's super relevant when you're a company operating on Samsung's kind of global scale.
that makes total sense. It's the common ground. Okay, let's zoom in a bit. From that incredible scale down to something that directly affects a lot of people listening in the chips inside their phones.
Yeah.
This brings us to that long-running Exynos versus Snapdragon debate.
Yes. The Silicon Divide. This is definitely a specific area that's caused, well, considerable discussion and sometimes real frustration among consumers.
So what was the deal?
For years, Samsung typically split the chips in its flagship Galaxy S phones. So they'd use Qualcomm Snapdragon chips in markets like the US, China, some others.
Right, the ones we usually got here.
Exactly. But then they'd put their own in-house Exynos chips in phones sold in Europe, the Middle East, India, other places.
And the core issue, reading through the sources, was that this often meant people were buying the same phone model.
Right, nominally the same.
But getting a pretty different experience depending on where they lived, because the chip inside could lead to noticeable differences in, performance, battery life?
Performance, battery life, yeah, even camera image processing quality sometimes. It essentially created two tiers of customers for the very same device.
That doesn't seem fair.
Well, precisely.
Yeah.
And this wasn't always just a tiny difference. Our sources flagged some specific pain points.
Like when?
The Exynos 990 chip, that was in the 2020 Galaxy S20 series. That one was widely seen as a real low point.
Okay.
It apparently significantly underperformed the Snapdragon 865 version, especially in graphics, how smoothly it handles complex visuals like in high-end games.
Right.
And these kinds of differences, according to the sources, you could trace them way back, even to the Galaxy S3 back in 2012.
Wow, so this was a persistent thing for like a decade. It wasn't just a one-off bad chip.
Pretty much, even later on. Take the 2022 Galaxy S22 series. It used the Exynos 2200 chip. Now, that one even had a partnership with AMD for the GPU, the graphics part, which sounded exciting.
Yeah, I remember that.
But still, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 in the other regions apparently blitzed the Exynos in graphical benchmarks, those standardized performance tests.
Ouch.
Yeah. And the Exynos version even reportedly struggled with specific demanding games like Diablo Immortal. Though, to be fair, some optimization issues with the game itself were also noted there.
Still, I can absolutely see why users would be frustrated, especially if you buy a flagship phone expecting, top-tier gaming or just really smooth performance.
Exactly. And it led to a lot of very vocal feedback. Enthusiasts, tech reviewers, really urging Samsung to just use Snapdragon everywhere.
Were people organized about it?
Oh, yeah. There were even online petitions calling for Samsung to either ditch Exynos entirely for the flagships or at least sell the Exynos versions cheaper to reflect the difference.
Makes sense. But then things changed, didn't they? I remember the Galaxy S23 that went global with Snapdragon, right?
It did. That was a really significant shift for the 2023 lineup. And yeah, welcomed by many users.
But it didn't last.
Well, no. The chip split came back for the S24 series in 2024. Yeah, the Exynos 2400 versus the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3.
Was the gap still bad?
The sources note the performance gap was less pronounced this time around. Still there in some areas, apparently, but smaller.
Okay.
And interestingly, they also point out that both S24 variants do support AV1 decoding, which is good for efficient video streaming.
Right, that's a technical plus. And now for 2025, with the S25, it sounds like Snapdragon is global again. Is that confirmed?
That's what the report cited and our sources seem to indicate, yeah. The reason given is that Samsung apparently couldn't produce enough of their next-gen chip, the Exynos 2500.
Production issues.
Seems like it. So while this long-running rivalry is on pause, at least for the main flagship line next year, it definitely raises questions about the future strategy for their whole in-house chip division.
Yeah, what happens next there? That's a fascinating deep dive into a really specific technical controversy that had real-world impact. Let's shift gears completely now from the tech inside the phone to the people who actually build these devices.
Okay.
And the environment inside those huge Samsung factories.
Right. So our sources give us a bit of a glimpse into a place like the Gumi factory in South Korea. It's enormous. employs over 10,000 workers.
10,000.
Yeah. And what really stands out from the description is that the vast majority of these employees are young women, mostly in their early 20s.
Okay, and here's where it gets, I thought, really interesting and kind of unexpected. The sources mention K-pop music.
Yes, played outdoors at the factory.
But not just randomly, right? There's a reason.
Exactly. It's specifically selected by a team of psychologists.
Psychologists picking the factory playlist. Why?
According to the sources, the music is chosen with the explicit goal of reducing employee stress levels. It's a surprising detail, isn't it? That blend of like massive industrial scale and this kind of psychological consideration you might not expect.
Definitely not the image I had. And the production method itself sounds different too, not the classic assembly line.
It isn't, apparently. It's described as a cellular basis.
Cellular basis.
Yeah, so instead of phones moving down this long line with each worker adding one specific part,
Right.
each employee sits at like a three-sided workbench and is responsible for the overall assembly of a device within their own cell, basically. All the tools right there.
Does that make it better for the workers?
Well, the description suggests it's designed to give individual workers maybe more involvement, more ownership over the process.
Okay. And despite that individual cell structure, the factory sounds incredibly connected globally.
Oh, absolutely. The sources mention computer stations all over the factory floor that have real-time access to manufacturing data from any Samsung facility anywhere in the world.
Wow. Total visibility.
It really underscores how tightly integrated their global production network must be.
Okay, now let's touch on a more historically controversial aspect. Samsung's long-standing position on labor unions.
Yeah, this is a big one. Our sources discuss a history stretching back almost 50 years, where Samsung actively, and sometimes reportedly with ferocious tactics, avoided unionization.
Ferocious tactics.
That's the phrase used in one source. It's been a really significant point of criticism regarding their labor practices over the decades.
But that seems to be changing, or at least there's been a shift recently. The sources mention a pretty notable public apology from Lee Jae-young. He's the company's effective head now, right?
Yes, the de facto leader. He did make an apology, acknowledging people who were hurt by this anti-union policy over the years, and he committed to guaranteeing workers' rights going forward.
When did that happen?
That apology came after the company started facing significant unionization efforts relatively recently, late last year, according to the sources.
So pressure might have played a role.
It certainly suggests a potential shift, maybe a significant one, in a very, very long-held corporate stance on labor relations.
Okay, let's move into what is perhaps the most complex and often controversial part of the whole Samsung story. We're talking about its leadership structure, the whole nature of the table, and these recurring legal issues that seem to plague its top leaders.
Right. This is where we talk about the ruling Lee dynasty that controls Samsung. As the biggest cable, it's fundamentally a family-controlled conglomerate, and it's just deeply, deeply intertwined with South Korea's economy and society.
And the sources have some descriptions of the family members themselves.
They do. They mention the now late patriarch, Lee Kun-hee, who is described in one source as a kind of mercurial loner.
Okay.
And his son and heir apparent, Lee Jae-young, was characterized, again, by one source as maybe more entitled than he was competent. Strong words.
Yeah, that's quite pointed. And this family control seems inseparable from a history of legal troubles, based on what we read.
This is one of the most striking and, frankly, consistent findings in the sources. They state pretty unequivocally that every single leader of Samsung has faced accusations or convictions or even jail time for serious crimes.
Every single one.
That's what the sources assert. Things like tax evasion, bribery, embezzlement, perjury.
Wow. What does that pattern even suggest about the relationship between that kind of immense corporate power, family control, and maybe the legal system within that cabal structure?
It raises really profound questions, doesn't it? About accountability, about governance right at the very top.
Definitely. And there was that huge scandal in 2017. The sources detailed that one quite a bit. Samsung bribing the president.
Yes, the South Korean president at the time.
What was the goal there? Why bribe the president?
Well, the sources report it was basically to win political support for a controversial corporate merger, a takeover.
Okay.
And this merger was seen as absolutely crucial for solidifying the family's control, Lee Jae-young's control specifically, over the entire Samsung empire, tightening the grip.
And Lee Jae-young himself was directly implicated in that.
Yes, he was convicted for bribery connected to that scandal. He served about a year in jail before he was released on appeal with a commuted sentence.
Right.
And the sources note he's actually currently undergoing a retrial for those same charges. It's still ongoing.
And he also made that public apology back in 2020, didn't he? We mentioned the union part, but it was broader.
He did? Yeah. In May 2020, he gave a broad apology for various controversies surrounding the company, including specifically the issues around the succession plan, that whole merger mess.
And he made a pledge then.
A pretty significant one. He stated he would not allow his children to succeed him in leading Samsung.
Really? Breaking the dynasty.
That's what he said. And he promised to act within the law going forward. Whether that holds, we'll see.
The sources also bring in claims from a former insider, right? A lawyer. Adds another layer to these allegations of misconduct.
Yes. The company's former chief lawyer, a man named Kim Young-Tool, he made some explosive claims back in 2007.
Like,
he alleged he was personally involved in bribing officials and even fabricating evidence on behalf of the chairman at the time, Lee Kun-hee.
fabricating evidence.
That was the allegation. He also claimed he was involved in training other executives to basically act as scapegoats, to take the fall to protect the chairman.
Wow.
And he also claimed he personally refused a $3.3 million bribe connected to a big U.S. memory chip price-fixing case Samsung was involved in.
That is quite the list of allegations from someone who was supposedly right there in the inner circle.
Very serious allegations, yeah. Coming from someone who would have been at the heart of their legal operations.
And beyond the top leadership and the family issues, the company itself, Samsung Electronics, has faced other big legal penalties, right? The sources detail those too.
They do. They point to major fines related to being part of a DRAM price-fixing cartel. Remember DRAM? Memory chips.
Vaguely, yeah. Price fixing.
Yeah. Conspiring with other manufacturers to fix prices between 1998 and 2002. Samsung got hit with a $145 million fine in Europe and a $120 million fine in Canada for it. And the Canadian case was interesting because it actually led to court-ordered refunds for Canadians who had bought electronics, computers, printers, whatever, containing those price-fixed memory chips.
So consumers actually got some money back from that one?
In Canada, yes. That doesn't always happen.
And more recently, there was a fine about their phones and water resistance claims.
Yes, that was in Australia in 2022. Samsung was fined AU $14 million.
Why?
For misleading advertising about the water resistance of several older Galaxy phone models, some S7s, S8s, Note 8s, I think.
What was misleading?
Well, their ads show the phones being used underwater, like in pools and stuff. But the fine came after numerous user complaints about problems, particularly the charger ports corroding after water exposure.
Ah, so the reality didn't quite match the slick ads.
Apparently not, according to the Australian court. It directly contradicted the advertising.
Okay. And finally, the sources just briefly mention Samsung's connection to that 2016 political scandal in Korea, where cables, including Samsung, were reported to have funded pro-government demonstrations.
Right.
And just to be clear, we're simply reporting what the source material states here, not taking any sides on the politics of it.
Exactly. But it just underscores, again, those incredibly close and often really complex ties between these massive business empires and the political landscape in South Korea.
It really emphasizes how deeply intertwined big business and national politics can be within that cable system.
Absolutely.
Okay, moving from those legal challenges and the complexities of the cable system, let's talk about the really unusual situation surrounding the patriarch, Lee Kun-hee, for years, and then maybe pivot to Samsung's surprising connection to global culture?
Right. The sources report a rather extraordinary situation regarding Lee Kun-hee after he had that heart attack back in 2014.
What happened?
Well, he was basically incapacitated. But the rumors, as reported in the sources, were that he was essentially being kept alive, described by some familiar with the situation as being on ice.
On ice, like medically sustained?
That was the implication in some reports. Seen almost as a, well, one source used the term corpse, while he technically remained chairman until his actual death was announced in 2020.
That sounds almost medieval. I mean, in a modern corporate world, that's unprecedented, isn't it? Why would that happen?
The sources suggest this really unique situation was reportedly linked to finalizing the incredibly complex inheritance process for the vast Samsung empire, sorting out the succession and the massive fortune.
Ah, inheritance taxes and control.
Potentially, yeah. It's a really stark contrast to how things usually work in Western corporate succession, and it just highlights again how deeply personal and familial control is embedded in the cable system.
Right.
Even potentially overriding what we'd consider normal corporate governance. And it raises that question posed in one of the sources,
Which,
given the sheer depth of talent, among Samsung's professional executives. Is the continued oversight by the founding family actually necessary anymore, or even beneficial?
Yeah, that's a really thought-provoking question, especially when you layer on that history of legal issues tied directly to the family's leadership and control attempts.
It really is. Okay, now let's shift gears completely. Something lighter, maybe?
Please.
Samsung's surprising link to the global phenomenon that is the Korean wave. Hallyu, K-pop, K-drama,
Yeah.
Korean movies taking over the world.
Right. How does a massive manufacturing conglomerate like Samsung connect to the global success of Korean culture? Seems like different worlds.
Well, the link is through a person, Mikey Lee.
Mikey Lee, who's that?
She's actually an heiress to the Samsung founding family. Her grandfather founded Samsung, but she's the vice chairwoman of CJ Group.
CJ Group. They do entertainment, right? Food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
CJ Group was actually spun off from Samsung decades ago. And according to the sources, Mikey Lee had this really clear, ambitious goal. She wanted to turn South Korea into a cultural powerhouse on the global stage.
Okay. And she played a key role in boosting Korean cinema specifically.
Absolutely. The sources describe how she brokered this really crucial deal with DreamWorks Animation, Spielberg's company, way back in the late 1990s.
A deal with DreamWorks. What did that do?
It was apparently transformative. It helped CJ Group become a cinematic powerhouse itself by giving them access to Hollywood talent, technology, distribution networks, things they didn't have before.
Learning from Hollywood.
And that infrastructure and expertise they built directly helped elevate Korean films, including, most famously, CJ Group producing Parasite.
Parasite, of course. The Oscar winner.
The one that won Best Picture. And Mikey Lee was right there on stage accepting the award for CJ. Her influence also helped bring other major Korean films like Old Boy, Joint Security Area, Snowpiercer to much wider international audiences.
That's an absolutely incredible connection, linking the industrial might and the legacy of the Samsung founding family through her to the global cultural impact of Korean cinema.
Yeah.
It just shows how far the ripples of these Kaibal families can actually extend.
It's definitely a surprising facet of the story, isn't it? Showing their reach goes way beyond just hardware and heavy industry.
Okay, finally, let's bring the conversation back to right now, the present day, and some of the major business challenges Samsung is grappling with, particularly in that absolutely critical chip market.
Yeah, our sources mentioned some pretty recent struggles. Samsung apparently apologized not too long ago for a really disappointing profit quarter. Profits dropped significantly, down to around $6.8 billion.
That's still billions, but a big drop for them.
A very big drop. And it was accompanied by this huge plunge in market value. One source described it as a $122 billion wipeout.
$122 billion drop in value. Ouch. What's driving that kind of fall?
Well, the sources explicitly link this drop, at least partly, to what they describe as a kind of crisis in their traditional memory chip business.
Okay.
And the really urgent need for Samsung to pivot and focus much more intensely on chips for artificial intelligence, AI chips.
Right. So while you see companies like NVIDIA and maybe TSMC who manufactures for them, their market values are just soaring into the trillions, right? Driven by this explosive demand for high-performance computing, AI chips.
Exactly. And that demand is boosting industrial production in places like Taiwan significantly.
Samsung is facing some serious headwinds in that exact same incredibly crucial market.
That seems to be the picture, yeah. Our sources point out that while, sure, smartphones are still a massive source of sales revenue for Samsung.
Right. They sell tons of
The
phones.
semiconductors, the chips, have actually been the main driver of profit for them in recent years.
So profit comes more from chips than phones.
Often, yes. So when they struggle in the chip business, it hits their bottom line particularly hard.
That really underscores just how vital success in this AI chip race is for Samsung's future profitability. It's standing in the global tech world. They're up against intense competition from companies maybe more narrowly focused on that high-growth AI area.
It's arguably one of their biggest strategic challenges right now, yeah. Navigating that incredibly rapid shift in semiconductor market demand towards AI.
Wow. Okay, we have really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the Samsung empire.
We certainly have.
We started with its absolutely staggering industrial scale, its economic importance to South Korea, dived into the nitty-gritty tech details and the consumer impact of their chip strategy.
The Exynos saga.
Exactly. Then we looked at the human side. Inside those massive factories, their shifting labor policies, then unpacked the really complex, often controversial dynamics of the family leadership, the chaebol structure, those recurring legal challenges.
The dark side, maybe?
Yeah. Then we explored that surprising link to the global Korean cultural wave, which was fascinating.
Particularly, yeah.
And finally brought it right back to the present, their current struggles, and that crucial future focus in the high-stakes AI chip market.
It's just so clear, isn't it, that Samsung is so much more than the devices you might hold in your hand or see on your wall. It's this incredibly powerful, multifaceted entity, deeply embedded in its home country's identity, while constantly having to navigate these major global economic currents, technological shifts, even political pressures.
So, considering Samsung's whole history, they've repeatedly faced and, well, attempted to overcome huge technological shifts, corporate controversies, global economic pressures, and now you have this current intense competition, this urgency in the AI chip market. What does their future trajectory mean, not just for the company itself, but for South Korea's economy, which relies so heavily on them, and really for the global tech landscape as a whole? What piece of this vast, complex empire story stands out most to you?